The fastest way to destroy a woman isn't to break her heart. It's to make the whole world believe she deserved it. I learned that lesson wearing a white wedding dress that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. My name is Charlotte Hayes, and 3 hours before sunset, I was supposed to become someone's wife. Instead, I became the woman strangers couldn't stop talking about. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers, every table wrapped in white roses and candlelight that reflected across polished marble floors. Everything looked exactly like the fairy tale I had spent 18 months planning, down to the string quartet playing my favorite song as guests settled into their seats. My father straightened his navy suit with nervous hands while my mother wiped happy tears from her cheeks. Even I almost believed life could be that kind. Then my phone vibrated. Once. Twice. 3 times. I smiled apologetically at my maid of honor, Emily, before glancing at the screen. Unknown number. The first message read, "Ask your groom where he was last night." The second arrived before I could breathe. A photograph. My fiancé, Daniel, standing beside another woman outside a luxury hotel. Their faces were close enough to invite assumptions. The third message came seconds later. Everyone else already knows. My stomach tightened so suddenly I thought I might faint. Emily noticed my expression immediately. "Charlotte, what's wrong?" I couldn't answer. The ballroom around me blurred into scattered lights and muffled conversations as another vibration echoed through my trembling hand. Social media notifications. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. My name was everywhere. #ScandalBride. I stared at the screen as headlines appeared faster than I could read them. Local entrepreneur's wedding rocked by shocking affair allegations. Bride accused of hiding truth. Wedding expected to collapse. None of it made sense. None of it belonged to my life. I looked toward the entrance just as Daniel walked inside. His tuxedo was flawless. His smile wasn't. He avoided my eyes. That hurt more than anything else. The whispers spread through the room like a cold breeze moving beneath locked doors. Conversation stopped. Phones quietly lifted. Guests who had celebrated with us minutes earlier suddenly looked at me with curiosity instead of kindness. Some looked away altogether. Others stared openly, hungry for the next chapter of a story they believed they already understood. Daniel climbed the small stage where we were supposed to exchange vows. He reached for the microphone with hands that looked surprisingly steady. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying through every speaker in the ballroom. "I can't go through with this wedding." Silence swallowed the room. My heartbeat became the only sound I recognized. I wanted him to explain. I wanted someone, anyone, to ask why. Instead, people simply accepted that the bride standing alone must somehow deserve the humiliation unfolding before them. I felt my bouquet slipping through numb fingers until white roses scattered across the marble floor. Nobody moved to help me pick them up. Not because they were cruel. Because they were uncomfortable. There's a difference, but it doesn't hurt any less. My father took one hesitant step toward me before reporters outside somehow found their way to the lobby doors. Camera flashes burst through the glass like sudden lightning. Someone called my name. Someone else shouted a question I couldn't understand. My entire future collapsed in less time than it takes champagne bubbles to disappear. As I stood frozen beneath thousands of dollars worth of crystal lights, wondering how a perfect day could vanish so completely, I never noticed the man standing quietly across the street in a black tailored suit. Everyone else was watching the scandal. He was watching me. The next morning I woke up wearing yesterday's makeup, yesterday's heartbreak, and a wedding dress hanging from my bedroom closet that no longer belonged to anyone. Sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin golden lines, but even the warmth of an early summer morning could not erase the cold knot sitting in my chest. My phone rested face down on the nightstand where Emily had placed it before leaving me alone to sleep. For one peaceful minute I considered never touching it again. Then reality reminded me that silence does not stop the world from talking. The screen lit up with thousands of notifications before I even unlocked it. Messages from relatives I barely knew. Friends asking if I was all right. Former classmates pretending they cared while secretly searching for details. News websites had recycled the same photographs from my engagement party, cropping my smile into headlines that painted me as either a liar or a victim depending on which version generated more clicks. The truth, I quickly learned, mattered far less than the story people wanted to believe. I closed every application without reading another comment, but echoes of complete strangers still followed me through the quiet house. My mother tried to make breakfast, placing pancakes in front of me exactly the way she had since I was 10 years old. I stared at them until the butter melted into a shapeless puddle. My father sat across from me with his coffee growing colder by the minute. Neither of them knew what to say. There are moments when love becomes painfully quiet because words are simply too small. By noon I convinced myself that going outside might make me feel normal again. I changed into jeans, tied my hair into a loose ponytail, and drove to the jewelry design studio where I had worked for almost 2 years. Creating engagement rings had once filled me with hope. Every diamond represented a promise. Every sketch imagined a future. I carried my portfolio inside, determined to lose myself in work, but the receptionist lowered her eyes before I even reached the front desk. She quietly asked me to wait in the conference room. My manager entered a few minutes later with the uncomfortable smile people wear when they have rehearsed disappointing news. He insisted the decision was not personal. The company simply wanted to avoid unwanted publicity. My projects would be reassigned. My clients would be transferred. Human resources would email the paperwork before the end of the day. I nodded politely because crying in front of him would not change anything. When I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the city looked exactly the same as it always had. Yellow cabs rolled past. People hurried toward office buildings carrying iced coffee. A street musician played an old jazz standard that drifted through the warm afternoon air. Somehow life continued as if mine had not fallen apart. I wandered several blocks without deciding where I was going until I noticed my reflection in the dark glass of an expensive jewelry boutique. For the first time since the wedding, I looked directly at myself. I did not see a scandal. I did not see a failure. I saw a tired woman trying to remember who she had been before the opinions of strangers became louder than her own voice. As I stood there searching for that forgotten version of myself, a sleek black sedan slowed across the street. Its tinted window lowered just enough for a pair of calm gray eyes to study me for a brief moment before the car disappeared into traffic, leaving me with the strange feeling that someone had just made a decision that would change my life again. I spent 3 days pretending I was not avoiding one simple decision. The velvet box sat unopened on my kitchen counter beside a stack of unpaid bills, catching the afternoon sunlight every time I walked past it. I told myself it was only a ring. Gold, a diamond, memories I no longer wanted. But every time my fingers reached for the box, another part of me whispered that letting it go would make everything permanent. On the 4th morning my checking account answered the question my heart could not. Rent was due in 6 days. My savings had nearly disappeared after losing my job, and unemployment paperwork moved slower than real life. I slipped the ring into my purse, put on the only blazer that still made me feel remotely professional, and drove downtown without turning on the radio. Silence felt kinder than sympathy. The jewelry district was already alive when I arrived. Storefront windows sparkled beneath bright display lights, filled with diamonds that looked untouched by disappointment. Couples admired engagement rings with hopeful smiles while tourists stopped to photograph elegant displays. I wondered if anyone could tell I had once believed I would be standing on the other side of those windows. A polished brass sign caught my attention. Blackwood Estate Jewelers. The name sounded old, established, almost intimidating. The display inside was unlike every other boutique on the block. There were fewer pieces, but each one seemed chosen rather than collected. Nothing screamed for attention. Confidence never needed to. I stepped through the glass door, and a soft chime echoed above me. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood and fresh coffee instead of expensive perfume. A gentleman in his 60s greeted me with a warm smile that did not carry an ounce of judgment. "Good afternoon. How may I help you today?" My voice almost failed me. "I would like to sell an engagement ring." He nodded with quiet understanding and invited me to a velvet chair beneath warm lighting. I placed the small box between us and carefully opened it. The diamond reflected tiny fragments of light across the polished walnut table. He adjusted his glasses and reached for a jeweler's loupe. Before he could examine it, instinct made me lean forward. Something about the stone felt wrong. It was not emotion. It was habit. 2 years of designing jewelry had trained my eyes to notice details most people ignored. "May I?" I asked softly. He looked surprised but handed me the loupe without hesitation. I studied the diamond for less than 30 seconds before turning it beneath the light again. The cut was excellent, but one facet reflected just slightly uneven. Barely visible. Almost impossible to notice. Almost. "The center stone has been replaced," I said quietly. "It is still beautiful, but it is not the certified diamond that belongs in this setting." The gentleman blinked twice before checking again himself. His eyebrows slowly lifted. "Remarkable." He disappeared into a private office and returned several minutes later carrying paperwork from the original purchase. His expression had completely changed. "You are correct," he admitted. "The certification number does not match." Heat rushed into my face. I had not expected to be right. I only trusted what years of careful observation had taught me. As the gentleman thanked me for my honesty, I never noticed the security camera above the showroom quietly turning. Somewhere beyond a locked door on the top floor, a man with calm gray eyes paused in the middle of an important meeting, watching my reflection on a silent monitor with the faintest hint of curiosity crossing his otherwise unreadable face. The elderly jeweler insisted on paying me the full value of the replacement stone even though my honesty had cost his store far more than that. I tried to refuse, explaining that anyone with the proper equipment would have discovered the mismatch eventually, but he only smiled and slid the check across the polished table. "Integrity is much harder to replace than a diamond, Miss Hayes," he said. "Please accept it." I thanked him, tucked the check carefully into my purse, and walked back into the warm afternoon sunlight feeling something I had not experienced since my wedding day. It was not happiness. It was dignity. Small, fragile, but still alive. I had barely reached the corner when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment I considered ignoring it, assuming it was another reporter or another stranger hoping to profit from my embarrassment. Instead I answered with cautious hesitation. "Miss Hayes?" a calm female voice asked. "My name is Victoria Bennett. I am calling on behalf of Blackwood Holdings. We would like to invite you to an interview tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I stopped walking. Traffic continued flowing around me while people hurried past carrying shopping bags and iced coffee, but the city suddenly sounded far away. "I think you may have the wrong person," I replied. "I recently lost my job." "No, Miss Hayes," she answered politely. "We are calling you specifically. Your experience in jewelry design has come highly recommended." Before I could ask another question, she provided an address in Midtown, thanked me for my time, and ended the call. I stared at the phone for several seconds, replaying every word. I had never applied to Blackwood Holdings. I had never even heard they were hiring. Emily nearly screamed when I told her over dinner. "Charlotte, do you know how exclusive they are? They own luxury brands all over the country." I shook my head. That is exactly why this does not make sense. Sleep came slowly that night. Hope can be just as unsettling as fear after disappointment has taught you not to expect good news. By 8:30 the following morning I stood outside a 40-story building wrapped in reflective glass that mirrored the bright blue summer sky. The lobby felt more like an art gallery than a corporate headquarters. White marble stretched beneath my shoes, fresh orchids decorated minimalist tables, and quiet conversations echoed through the spacious atrium. Every employee moved with calm confidence, never rushing, never raising a voice. I checked in at the reception desk and was escorted to an executive conference room overlooking Manhattan. While I waited, my eyes wandered toward a display case built into the far wall. Inside rested a sapphire necklace unlike anything I had ever seen. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, yet something caught my attention immediately. One tiny setting along the left side interrupted the natural flow of the design. It was subtle enough that almost no customer would ever notice, but once I saw it I could not unsee it. Minutes later the conference room door opened. A silver-haired executive entered carrying a leather portfolio and offered a courteous handshake. "Thank you for coming, Miss Hayes." Before the interview even began, I found myself glancing back toward the necklace. Finally I spoke without thinking. "Whoever designed that piece is exceptionally talented," I said quietly. "But one stone should be rotated 2 degrees clockwise. The symmetry will finally match the curve of the neckline." The executive looked toward the display, then back at me with visible surprise. Neither of us realized that behind the dark glass of the observation room next door, Adrian Blackwood had just heard every word. The interview lasted almost an hour, but nobody asked the questions I had prepared to answer. They never mentioned my failed wedding. They never referred to the headlines that had followed me across the internet. Instead they placed sketches, gemstones, and unfinished designs on the conference table, watching quietly as I explained what I saw. It felt less like an interview and more like someone trying to understand how my mind worked. By the time I left the building, I still had no idea whether I had impressed anyone. 2 days passed without a single phone call. I told myself not to expect one. Rejection had become familiar enough that silence almost felt comforting. On the third afternoon I was sitting at my apartment dining table surrounded by old design notebooks, searching freelance websites for anything that could cover next month's bills, when my phone rang again. It was Victoria. "Miss Hayes, congratulations. We would like to offer you a 6-month consulting contract with Blackwood Holdings." I nearly dropped the pencil in my hand. "Consulting?" I repeated. "I thought you were hiring a designer." "Your position is unique," she replied. "You will evaluate rare collections, assist with custom commissions, and contribute original concepts for our executive clients." The salary she mentioned was almost twice what I had earned before. I honestly thought I had misunderstood. There must be someone more qualified. Victoria laughed softly. "That decision has already been made." After ending the call, I remained perfectly still. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet. I read the contract 3 times after it arrived by email, searching for hidden conditions or impossible expectations. Everything appeared legitimate. Excellent benefits. Flexible hours. Professional confidentiality. The only unusual clause required that all high-profile client identities remain strictly private. That seemed reasonable for a luxury company. Emily hugged me so tightly that evening I almost spilled my coffee. "See," she said with a grin. Somebody finally recognized what everyone else was too distracted to notice. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze drifting between the buildings of Midtown. I wore a charcoal blazer, comfortable heels, and the small silver necklace my grandmother had given me when I graduated from design school. It reminded me that my worth had existed long before strangers tried to define it. My new employee badge granted access to a private design floor unlike anything I had ever imagined. Individual studios lined wide hallways filled with natural light. Gemologists examined rare stones beneath precision lamps while artists sketched quietly beside enormous windows overlooking the city. The atmosphere was calm, focused, almost reverent. Shortly before lunch, Victoria approached carrying a black presentation case. "We have something special for your first assignment," she said. Inside rested an extraordinary emerald necklace awaiting restoration before an international exhibition. I carefully lifted it onto the velvet workspace, studying every angle beneath the magnifying lamp. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, yet one tiny clasp had been repaired using modern techniques that interrupted the historical integrity of the entire piece. "This restoration should be reversed," I said almost immediately. The original artisan intended the weight to rest differently across the collarbone. Whoever repaired it solved the damage but changed the design. Victoria stared at me in complete silence before excusing herself with unusual urgency. Less than 5 minutes later, every conversation across the studio seemed to soften. Employees glanced discreetly toward the far end of the hallway as a tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit walked through the open doors with calm, unhurried confidence. I recognized the gray eyes before anyone spoke his name. They were the same eyes that had watched me from the black sedan and the same eyes hidden behind the observation glass. Adrian Blackwood finally stood only a few feet away, studying the necklace for a brief moment before lifting his gaze to meet mine, and for reasons I could not explain, I had the unmistakable feeling that this job had never been an accident. Adrian Blackwood did not introduce himself with unnecessary words. He simply extended his hand across the work table, his expression calm enough to make the entire studio feel quieter. "Miss Hayes," he said in a deep, measured voice. "Welcome to Blackwood Holdings." His handshake was firm without trying to prove anything. That surprised me more than it should have. Powerful men I had met in the past often mistook confidence for performance. Adrian did not seem interested in performing for anyone. "Thank you," I replied. "I appreciate the opportunity." His eyes shifted briefly toward the emerald necklace resting beneath the inspection lamp. "Victoria tells me you identified the restoration immediately." I nodded. "The repair is technically excellent. It simply changes the balance the original designer intended." He studied the necklace for another moment before looking back at me. "Interesting. Most people see jewelry as decoration. You see intention." I did not know how to answer that. The truth was that every piece told a story if someone cared enough to listen. Adrian gave a slight nod as though silence itself had answered his question. "Walk with me." We left the design studio and stepped into a private hallway lined with framed sketches dating back nearly a century. Every drawing carried handwritten notes beside precise measurements. It felt less like a corporate office and more like a museum dedicated to craftsmanship. "These were my grandfather's designs," Adrian said. "He believed beauty without purpose never lasts." I slowed to admire a delicate bracelet illustrated in faded pencil. He was right. Adrian glanced toward me with an expression that softened almost imperceptibly. Not many people notice that. We continued toward a spacious office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the room with afternoon sunlight, reflecting against shelves filled with antique books instead of trophies. The simplicity caught me off guard. I had expected extravagance. Instead, I found restraint. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and placed one in front of me before taking a seat across the conference table. "There is something you should know about this company," he said. "Our clients value privacy above everything else. You may hear rumors about me. About this business. About people who walk through these doors." His tone remained steady, almost detached. "I advise you to judge only what you see for yourself." The words lingered longer than I expected. Rumors. During the past week, I had overheard whispers from employees in the lobby and read passing comments online. Adrian Blackwood was described as influential, mysterious, unreachable. Some articles praised his business empire while others hinted at connections nobody could quite explain. None offered evidence. Only speculation. I looked directly into his gray eyes. I learned recently that rumors can become louder than facts. For the first time, a faint smile reached the corners of his mouth. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came. "Then perhaps you understand better than most." He opened a leather folder and slid another document toward me. "One more thing. The consulting position includes access to executive accommodations, transportation, and additional financial benefits should you require them." I barely glanced at the numbers before pushing the folder back across the table. "I appreciate the offer, but I would rather earn whatever I receive." The room fell completely still. Adrian rested one hand lightly against the folder without taking his eyes off me. "You realize nobody refuses that package." I managed a small smile despite my racing heartbeat. Then today can be the first time. Several quiet seconds passed between us before he finally closed the folder. There was no disappointment in his face. If anything, there was respect. He rose from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking the city below. Without turning around, he spoke in the same calm voice. Good. Choose your place here because you believe you deserve it. Never because someone else offers it to you. As I left his office a few minutes later, I realized something had changed. I still did not know who Adrian Blackwood truly was, but for the first time since my life had unraveled, I had met someone who looked at me without seeing the scandal first. The day settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. Every morning I crossed the marble lobby carrying a sketchbook instead of disappointment. Every afternoon brought another collection of rare gemstones, antique settings, or unfinished commissions that challenged everything I thought I knew about jewelry design. Blackwood Holdings demanded excellence without ever raising its voice. That quiet expectation pushed me harder than any deadline ever had. Adrian rarely appeared without purpose. Some days I caught a glimpse of him walking through the design floor, exchanging a few calm words with department directors before disappearing into another meeting. Other days he never left the executive level at all. Yet somehow he always seemed to know exactly what every project needed. One Thursday afternoon I was adjusting a vintage sapphire bracelet beneath the inspection lamp when Victoria stopped beside my workstation. "Mr. Blackwood would like your opinion," she said. I followed her into one of the private presentation rooms where a collection of custom engagement pieces rested inside velvet display cases. Adrian stood near the windows reviewing architectural drawings with two executives. The conversation ended the moment we entered. He thanked them politely, and they left without hesitation. "I need an honest answer," he said, sliding a platinum necklace toward me. Our client requested additional diamonds along the center line. I examined the piece carefully before shaking my head. "They will make it more expensive," I replied. "Not more beautiful." Adrian folded his arms. "Explain." I picked up a pencil and lightly sketched over the design. "The empty space here is intentional. It allows the eye to appreciate the center stone instead of competing with it. Sometimes restraint creates more luxury than excess." He studied my sketch in complete silence before placing the original design aside. "Approve Miss Hayes's revision," he said to Victoria. "Use her version." There was no debate. No second opinion. Just trust. As the weeks passed, I began noticing details about Adrian that never appeared in magazine articles. Every Friday fresh flowers arrived in the employee lounge without explanation. Birthday cards were signed personally instead of electronically. When one of the security officers quietly mentioned that his wife was recovering from surgery, Adrian adjusted the man's schedule before anyone even requested it. None of those moments attracted attention because they were never meant to. They simply happened. One rainy evening I stayed late finishing gemstone evaluations before an upcoming exhibition. The office had nearly emptied when I realized I had forgotten my umbrella. I sighed, preparing myself for several soaking blocks back to the subway station, but the receptionist smiled as I reached the lobby. "Mr. Blackwood left this for you." She handed me a large black umbrella with the company logo embroidered along the edge. "He noticed the weather forecast this morning." I looked toward the revolving doors where the rain poured across the streets in silver sheets beneath the city lights. "Where is he?" I asked. "He already left." Outside, traffic crawled through the storm while reflections shimmered across the wet pavement. I opened the umbrella and began the walk toward the station, wondering why such a small gesture felt so unexpectedly meaningful. The following Monday I discovered the answer was simply who he was. I arrived early and accidentally passed the courtyard behind the building before entering through the employee entrance. Hidden beneath tall maple trees was a small playground belonging to a children's community center supported by the company. Adrian stood there without his suit jacket, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, patiently helping a little boy assemble a wooden birdhouse while several children laughed around a picnic table covered with paint and tiny brushes. There were no cameras. No reporters. No speeches. Just a man listening carefully as a little girl proudly explained why every birdhouse should be painted bright yellow because, in her words, sunshine deserved a home too. Adrian smiled, picked up the yellow paintbrush without correcting her, and in that quiet ordinary moment, the most powerful man I had ever met looked nothing like the rumors that surrounded his name. The first sign that peace never lasts arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. My coffee had already gone cold beside my sketchbook when Victoria hurried across the design studio carrying a tablet instead of her usual clipboard. She rarely looked flustered, which made the tension in her expression impossible to ignore. "Charlotte," she said quietly, "Mr. Blackwood would like to see you." My stomach tightened before I even stood up. During the past 6 weeks, every meeting with Adrian had centered on design reviews, client presentations, or antique restorations. This felt different. The executive conference room overlooked the same skyline I had begun to associate with fresh starts, but the atmosphere inside had changed completely. A large television displayed several entertainment websites, each showing my photograph beside headlines I had hoped never to see again. Someone had revived the wedding scandal. Old images were being reposted alongside newly invented stories claiming I had manipulated my way into Blackwood Holdings for money and influence. Anonymous sources insisted I had targeted wealthy men from the beginning. The lies multiplied faster than anyone could deny them. I stood frozen, unable to look away. "I am sorry," I whispered, although I did not even know what I was apologizing for. Adrian turned off the screen with a single press of the remote. Silence filled the room. "Why are you apologizing?" he asked calmly. "Because this company hired me, and now this follows me here." He studied me for several seconds before speaking. "Reputation built on rumors collapses under facts. Reputation built on character survives both." His voice never rose. It did not need to. Somehow the certainty behind those words quieted the panic racing through my chest. "Our communications department can release a statement," I offered. "If my resignation would protect the company, I understand." Adrian looked genuinely puzzled, as though the idea had never crossed his mind. "Do you wish to resign?" "No." "Have you failed your responsibilities here?" "No." "Then the conversation is finished." I blinked, unsure I had heard him correctly. "It is that simple?" A faint smile touched his face. "Most unnecessary problems become simple once pride leaves the room." Before I could answer, someone knocked softly on the office door. Victoria stepped inside carrying a luxury fashion magazine. The newest issue had just been released. Across 2 full pages appeared an article speculating about Blackwood Holdings hiring the city's most infamous runaway bride. The writer questioned my professionalism without ever contacting me for a comment. I lowered my eyes, embarrassed all over again. Adrian accepted the magazine, closed it without reading another page, and placed it neatly into a recycling bin beside his desk. "Paper cannot decide who you are," he said. "Neither can strangers." That afternoon I tried to lose myself in work, but whispers had already begun spreading beyond the building. Most employees remained kind, yet I caught a few unfamiliar faces glancing toward me before quickly looking away. It reminded me too much of the ballroom on my wedding day. For one frightening hour I wondered whether history had found me again. As evening approached, I packed my bag later than usual, hoping the empty lobby would spare me curious stares. Instead I found Adrian standing near the entrance speaking quietly with the security team. He noticed me immediately. "Walk with me." We stepped outside into the cool evening air where the city glowed beneath thousands of office lights. Reporters waited across the street hoping for photographs, but Adrian never altered his pace. Neither did I. Cameras flashed from a distance as traffic rolled between us. I expected him to avoid the attention. Instead he continued walking beside me in full view of everyone, saying nothing at all. It was only later, after seeing the next morning's photographs, that I understood exactly what he had done. Every headline now carried a different question. They were no longer asking who I was. They were asking why Adrian Blackwood had chosen to stand beside me. The invitation arrived on thick ivory cardstock embossed with silver lettering that caught the light every time I turned it in my hands. The annual Blackwood Heritage Auction. Attendance by invitation only. I had heard employees talking about it for weeks. Collectors, museum curators, philanthropists, and some of the most influential families in the country would gather beneath one roof to bid on extraordinary pieces that rarely appeared in public. Victoria smiled as she placed the envelope on my desk. "Mr. Blackwood would like you to attend as part of the design team." I stared at the invitation in disbelief. "Me?" She nodded. "One of your restored collections will be presented tonight. You earned your place there." Excitement and nervousness wrestled inside me throughout the afternoon. By early evening I stood before the mirror in my apartment wearing a midnight blue gown borrowed from Emily, simple silver earrings, and the small necklace from my grandmother that I refused to leave behind. It reminded me that elegance never depended on price. The ballroom occupied the top floor of one of Manhattan's oldest historic hotels. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble just as they had on the day my own wedding collapsed, and for one terrifying moment my heartbeat stumbled. Memories have strange ways of borrowing familiar rooms. I almost turned around before stepping inside, but then I remembered Adrian's words. "Reputation built on character survives." I lifted my shoulders and kept walking. The exhibition hall glowed beneath warm lighting designed to make every gemstone appear almost alive. Guests admired rare diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires displayed inside elegant glass cases while a chamber orchestra played softly near the grand staircase. My restored emerald necklace rested at the center of one gallery, surrounded by quiet conversations and appreciative smiles. For the first time in months people discussed my work instead of my past. Then I heard my name spoken behind me. "Charlotte Hayes." I turned slowly. Daniel stood only a few feet away wearing an expensive tuxedo and the same polished smile that had once convinced me I could trust him. Beside him stood a woman I recognized immediately from the photograph that had destroyed my wedding day. "You look different," he said carefully. "I heard you found another opportunity." His voice sounded friendly enough that strangers nearby could have mistaken us for old friends. I managed a polite nod. "Congratulations on your engagement," I replied, noticing the diamond on the woman's hand. His smile faded for the briefest second. There were misunderstandings. Before I could answer, another guest approached carrying a champagne glass and laughed lightly. "Is this the famous bride everyone was talking about?" The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. Nearby conversation slowed almost instantly. Several guests glanced toward me with the same curiosity I remembered from months earlier. My cheeks grew warm. I could almost feel the whispers gathering again. Daniel remained silent. He did not defend me. He simply watched, as though waiting to see what would happen next. I lowered my eyes toward the polished marble floor, suddenly wishing I could disappear into its reflection. Then the quiet sound of approaching footsteps reached my ears. The conversations around us stopped completely. I looked up just as Adrian Blackwood crossed the gallery with his usual calm confidence. He did not rush. He did not frown. He simply walked until he stood beside me. Without asking permission or making a grand announcement, he gently took my hand in his. His grip was steady, respectful, and completely unshaken by the dozens of eyes watching us. He looked directly at the small gathering before speaking in the same composed voice I had come to recognize. "Miss Hayes designed the restoration that every collector in this room has spent the evening admiring." His gaze moved across the silent crowd. "If you wish to discuss someone tonight, I suggest discussing excellence." No one answered. They simply looked from him to me and back again. For the second time in my life I stood beneath crystal chandeliers surrounded by strangers, but this time I was no longer standing there alone. The silence that followed Adrian's words lasted only a few seconds, yet it changed the entire evening. Conversations slowly returned, but they no longer revolved around gossip. Guests drifted toward the exhibition displays with renewed curiosity, studying the emerald necklace through a different lens now that they knew who had restored it. I finally released a breath I had not realized I had been holding. Adrian let go of my hand just as naturally as he had taken it, never turning the moment into something larger than it needed to be. "Enjoy your evening, Miss Hayes," he said quietly before greeting another group of guests waiting to speak with him. There was no dramatic gesture. No attempt to rescue me from my own life. He had simply reminded the room that my work deserved to be seen before my past. I wandered through the gallery feeling lighter than I had in months. A museum curator from Boston stopped to compliment the restoration techniques on the emerald necklace and asked thoughtful questions about preserving antique settings. A collector from Dallas requested my opinion on an Art Deco bracelet he hoped to acquire. Even a retired gemologist introduced himself simply because he appreciated the balance in one of my design sketches displayed beside the collection. Nobody mentioned my failed wedding. They wanted to discuss craftsmanship instead. It felt like breathing fresh air after standing inside a crowded room for far too long. As the live auction began, guests gathered beneath the grand chandelier while illuminated display platforms rotated slowly across the stage. Rare diamonds sparkled beneath carefully positioned lights, drawing quiet admiration from every corner of the ballroom. One extraordinary sapphire pendant sold for more than $2 million. An antique tiara found a new home with a private museum. Every successful bid raised additional funds for educational arts programs supported by the Blackwood Foundation, and the applause after each sale sounded sincere rather than ceremonial. Midway through the evening, the auctioneer invited everyone to direct their attention toward the restored emerald necklace. My heart immediately began racing. I had known it would be presented, but hearing my work introduced before hundreds of distinguished guests felt completely different from imagining it. The auctioneer spoke briefly about the necklace's history before unexpectedly adding one final sentence. The remarkable restoration was completed by Miss Charlotte Hayes, whose dedication preserved the integrity of the original artisan's vision. Soft applause spread across the ballroom. I stood frozen near the side gallery, uncertain whether to smile or disappear. Then more people joined in. The applause grew warmer, fuller, until I realized they were applauding the work itself. Not a headline. Not a rumor. Not a mistake. My work. Victoria appeared beside me with tears shining in her eyes. "You earned every bit of this," she whispered. The necklace ultimately sold for a record amount, drawing a standing ovation from several longtime collectors who appreciated the care taken to preserve its historical character. Reporters who had arrived hoping for another scandal instead surrounded museum experts asking about restoration techniques and design philosophy. One journalist politely requested an interview with me. For a split second I almost refused out of habit. Then I remembered the frightened woman who had once believed hiding was safer than speaking. "I would be happy to discuss the collection," I answered with a smile. The interview lasted only a few minutes, and every question focused on artistry rather than personal gossip. As the ballroom slowly emptied near midnight, I paused beside the tall windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights shimmered across the city like tiny diamonds scattered beneath the night sky. Adrian quietly joined me without interrupting the silence. "Quite a difference from your first public appearance this year," he observed. I looked out across the skyline before answering. Tonight people finally saw what I create instead of what they assumed. Adrian nodded almost imperceptibly. "The right people usually do. It simply takes longer than we would like." I smiled at the reflection in the glass, realizing something remarkable had happened without my noticing. The world had not changed overnight. I had. The auction became a turning point I could measure in quiet moments rather than headlines. During the weeks that followed, new commissions arrived almost faster than I could organize them. Collectors requested consultations by name. Museums invited Blackwood Holdings to collaborate on restoration projects, and for the first time since graduating from design school, my calendar filled because of my work instead of someone else's opinion. One Friday afternoon, Victoria placed a thick folder on my desk with a smile that looked almost proud. "These are all projects that specifically requested you." I laughed in disbelief as I flipped through the pages. Some clients wanted antique jewelry restored. Others wanted completely original engagement rings that reflected family histories rather than fashion trends. Every request reminded me that trust is earned one careful decision at a time. As I closed the folder, a handwritten envelope slipped onto the desk. There was no return address. Inside was a simple thank you card from a young couple whose heirloom wedding ring I had quietly repaired several weeks earlier. They wrote that the ring now looked exactly as the bride's grandmother remembered it decades ago. I read the note twice before placing it carefully inside my sketchbook. Diamonds were valuable, but moments like that felt priceless. Later that afternoon, I stopped by Victoria's office to discuss scheduling. While she searched through several contracts, an old leather binder accidentally slid from the top shelf and landed open across the floor. Loose documents scattered between us. "I am so sorry," I said, kneeling to help gather everything. Most of the papers were routine project reports until one familiar photograph caught my attention. It was a security image from Blackwood Estate Jewelers. I recognized myself standing at the walnut counter holding Daniel's engagement ring beneath the jeweler's loupe. The date printed in the corner matched the day I had discovered the replacement diamond. Before I could ask anything, Victoria gently took the photograph from my hand. She hesitated for only a moment before offering a quiet smile. "I suppose you deserve to know." She invited me to sit down and closed the office door. "Mr. Blackwood noticed you that day because nobody had ever identified that substitution without laboratory equipment. He asked us to learn more about your work after the store manager explained what had happened." I listened in complete silence. "When your former employer decided to let you go," she continued, "one of our recruiters had already begun reviewing your portfolio. The interview was real. Every assignment was earned. But the opportunity existed because someone recognized your talent before you believed anyone else still could." I stared at the photograph again, remembering the strange feeling that someone had been watching from somewhere beyond the showroom. "He knew about me before I ever met him," I whispered. Victoria nodded. "He also instructed every department that your projects would be evaluated only on merit. No special treatment. No sympathy. He believed respect lasts longer when it is earned." 1,000 small moments suddenly connected inside my mind. The unexpected interview. The trust he had placed in my judgment. The way he had refused to discuss rumors yet never ignored my potential. None of it had been coincidence. As I left Victoria's office, I found Adrian standing alone near the design gallery studying one of the original sketches now prepared for a new exhibition. He looked up as I approached, immediately recognizing the expression on my face. "You knew," I said softly. He nodded once. "I knew you deserved a chance." I searched for words large enough to match the gratitude filling my heart, but none seemed sufficient. "Why?" I finally asked. Adrian looked toward the sketch resting beneath the display light before answering. "Because the world had already spent enough time judging what happened to you. Someone still needed to notice who you were before any of it happened." In that quiet answer I understood the greatest gift he had ever given me. He had never tried to save my life. He had simply refused to let one terrible day become my entire identity. The truth arrived on an ordinary Wednesday morning disguised as a legal envelope. It was delivered directly to my office without ceremony, resting quietly beside my sketchbook before I even noticed it. Inside was a formal affidavit from a private investigator hired months earlier by Daniel's own family during a business dispute that had nothing to do with me. As I carefully read each page, the pieces of my past slowly rearranged themselves into something I had never expected. The photograph that had destroyed my wedding had been intentionally presented without context. It had been taken during a meeting arranged weeks before the ceremony, and the story surrounding it had been exaggerated until it no longer resembled reality. Anonymous online accounts had amplified false assumptions within hours, allowing speculation to replace facts before anyone involved had spoken publicly. By the time the truth became available, almost nobody had cared enough to look for it. I lowered the papers onto my desk and closed my eyes. I had spent months believing I had somehow failed, when in reality I had simply been caught inside a story written by strangers. Victoria quietly entered my office after knocking once. The investigator requested that every person affected receive the findings, she explained. Several publications are preparing formal corrections. I nodded without speaking. I had imagined this moment countless times. I thought vindication would feel like triumph. Instead it felt strangely peaceful, almost weightless. That afternoon nearly every major publication that had once repeated the original rumors released updated articles acknowledging that the earlier reporting had relied on incomplete information and unsupported claims. Some editors issued public apologies. Others quietly revised their archives without fanfare. Social media reacted just as quickly as it had before, except this time people expressed sympathy instead of suspicion. It was remarkable how easily public opinion changed once someone else gave it permission. My phone rang continuously throughout the afternoon. Former coworkers wanted to reconnect. Distant relatives suddenly remembered my birthday. Even companies that had quietly rejected my job applications months earlier reached out to congratulate me on my recent success. I answered none of the calls. There was nothing left to prove. Later that evening I received one final request. Daniel wanted to meet. Curiosity, not resentment, convinced me to accept. We met at a quiet cafe overlooking the Hudson River just before sunset. He looked older than I remembered, not because of time but because regret has a way of settling across a person's face. He apologized without making excuses. He admitted he had remained silent when the rumor spread because protecting his own reputation had seemed easier than defending mine. His family had encouraged him to move forward quickly, believing public attention would eventually disappear. He lowered his eyes before finishing the sentence that mattered most. I should have stood beside you. I listened carefully before answering. Months earlier those words would have shattered me. Now they simply sounded honest. Yes, I replied gently. You should have. Silence settled between us while the evening sun reflected across the river in ribbons of gold. There was no anger left inside me. Carrying it any longer would only keep me connected to a version of my life that no longer existed. I wished him well, stood from the table, and walked away without looking back. Forgiveness, I realized, is not forgetting what happened. It is deciding that someone else's mistake no longer deserves control over your future. When I returned to Blackwood Holdings the next morning, employees greeted me exactly as they had the day before. No celebration. No speeches. No awkward sympathy. They smiled because to them I had never stopped being Charlotte Hayes. As I reached my desk, I noticed Adrian standing quietly near the design gallery watching craftsmen prepare the next exhibition. He looked toward me with the same calm expression he had worn since the beginning, and in that simple moment I understood something the newspapers never could. My reputation had finally been restored, but my dignity had returned long before the headlines ever changed. Several months later autumn arrived in Manhattan with cool mornings, golden leaves drifting across quiet sidewalks, and a feeling that life had finally learned how to breathe again. Blackwood Holdings unveiled its newest private collection inside a renovated gallery overlooking Central Park, and this time my name appeared beside the exhibition instead of hidden quietly behind it. Visitors admired restored heirlooms, original sketches, and custom designs that carried stories instead of simply displaying wealth. Standing among them, I realized that every piece reflected the same lesson. Beauty was never created by perfection alone. It was shaped by patience, resilience, and the willingness to preserve what others considered broken. The evening reception unfolded with effortless elegance. Museum directors exchanged ideas with young design students. Families wandered through the exhibits together. Laughter echoed beneath warm lighting that made every gemstone shimmer without overwhelming the room. It felt less like an exclusive event and more like a celebration of craftsmanship itself. Emily squeezed my arm and whispered, "Look around. They came because of your work." I smiled, remembering the woman who once believed she would never again walk confidently into a crowded room. Later that evening Victoria approached with a familiar expression. Mr. Blackwood asked if you would meet him upstairs before everyone leaves. I found Adrian standing alone on the rooftop terrace where the city stretched endlessly beneath a sky filled with early stars. The cool breeze carried the distant sounds of traffic softened by height and distance. For several quiet moments neither of us spoke. We simply looked across the skyline that had witnessed every version of our story. Finally Adrian placed a small velvet box on the stone railing between us. I looked at it without moving. The sight of a jewelry box would once have awakened fear inside me. Now it only invited curiosity. "Open it," he said gently. Inside rested a remarkable loose diamond, neither oversized nor extravagant, but extraordinary in its clarity. It reflected the city lights in quiet flashes instead of brilliant bursts. I looked up in surprise. "It is beautiful," I whispered. Adrian nodded. "It was acquired years ago for a commission that was never completed. I kept waiting for the right purpose." I carefully closed the box and held it in both hands. "I cannot accept something this valuable." His expression remained calm, unchanged by my hesitation. "You misunderstand." He stepped beside me and looked out across the glowing skyline once more. "This is not a reward. It is not an obligation. It is certainly not a proposal." A small laugh escaped me before I could stop it. He smiled faintly in return. "It is recognition." He turned toward me with the quiet certainty I had come to trust. "The world spent months calling you disgraced. I never saw disgrace. I saw someone who refused to let humiliation become identity. I saw someone who chose honesty when deception would have been easier. I saw someone who continued creating beauty after the world stopped looking for it." My eyes filled before I realized tears had begun to gather. Adrian continued in the same steady voice. "Diamonds become extraordinary because they survive unimaginable pressure without losing what they are. People are not so different." For a long moment I could not speak. The city lights shimmered through my tears until Manhattan itself seemed to sparkle like the stone resting inside the velvet box. At last I found my voice. "You gave me a chance when I had forgotten how to believe in myself." Adrian shook his head almost imperceptibly. "No, Charlotte. You earned every opportunity. I simply refused to let noise drown out the truth." As we stood together beneath the autumn sky, I finally understood that the greatest treasures in life are never measured by carats, fortunes, or headlines. They are measured by the rare people who recognize your worth long before the rest of the world notices it. If there is one lesson my story will always carry, it is this. The people who judge you first usually remember your mistakes. The people who truly see you remember your character. And in the end, character always shines longer than any diamond ever could.